Hi everyone. In this video, we're going to go over the new Ivy generator, which is going to be included in the new version of the PCG Graph, and the couple of nodes that this involves. You can see here, this is pretty much an example of what you can achieve with it. It's very flexible. It has quite a lot of features, and it has hanging tendrils. It can go on the ground, on the ceiling, can span different distances. It actually can do outside and inside corners and kind of adapts to different surfaces. Um, so yeah, let's get started. We're just going to go to a new scene over here, and we're going to create a setup from scratch. So in this scene, as you can see, we just have these two cubes. They're just 10 by 10 by 10. And we're going to go through the setup. So we'll start by right-clicking somewhere here in the hierarchy, and we're going to create a PCG manager. All right, and we're going to create a new graph and open it. And what we're going to need is a curve. So I'm going to go to the PCG manager, create curve. Okay, and then we can move it a little bit over here. Then we'll hold shift, and then we can click on the first surface over here, and then we'll click on this surface over here to get a second point. Okay. And we can also create one in the middle, just so we can create a little bit of a curve. And okay, so now we have like a little catenary running across. Okay, so we have a curve. Now we can go to a graph and we'll hit space or right click, we hit space, and then we'll search for Ivy, and we'll get the Ivy generator node. And see, the Ivy generator node takes points, so we need to get the points from our curve. So we're going to look for the sample curve node, and we can take the points from that. However, we also need to get the curve somehow. So we're going to create a property for a curve. I'm going to name this Ivy curve. Okay, and then we're going to drag it into the graph and connect it to our sample curve. So we can save this, and now in our PCG manager we have the expose property here. We can drag a curve, all right, and this will connect everything. We're still not going to see anything because there's nothing being generated. So we get the ivy, but the ivy just contains the points of the vines. So if we turn the ivy generator debug mode, and at the bottom you have different debug layers, we can see, okay, main stem, so we can turn this on. And if I turn the debug, we'll see, okay, this is the main stem of the ivy, or I can switch this to branches, and then we'll see a much more complex debug visualization for, you can see all here the kind of crawling branches and all the hanging tendrils and all that. So I'm going to turn this off. Save. Actually don't need the debug mode here. So for us to actually see the ivy without having to debug it, we have to run it through the sweep node. And if you've already used the PCG graph, you know that the sweep node looked a little bit different, so it's been expanded to support the ivy generator. And you'll notice there's a couple of new settings in here, but we'll just hit save for now, and you can see, okay, this is the ivy kind of base without any additional settings. So this is just what the vines are going to look like. Now this doesn't look very natural. It doesn't have the tapering that a typical vine would have. So we can turn this on and use point value, which means that the sweep will use the taper value for each point. So basically, when the ivy generator creates the points for the vine, it also stores the taper value for each of those points based on the distance from the main stem and the um, children and so on, right? So we can turn this on and then we'll see, okay, this now has that organic vine look. So all we need to do here is add a material. So we'll add a material to our properties. We'll call this ivy, or we can call it vine material. And we'll drag this in here, do the sweep. And then in the vine material here in our graph, we can now look for the ivy material. I have the ivy vine right here. We'll edit. And now we have an actual material on our vine, which is great. Now, this looks okay, but it doesn't really, if I move this up, you can see the vine is just going up in the air. The same thing here. And that's not really what we want. I mean, you could snap these points manually onto the cube, but it's a lot of work. It's tedious, and every time you change the surface, you have to like readjust these points. So that's not how we want to handle this. So we need something between the sample and the ivy generator, and there's a new node for that, which is called project to nearest surface. So we had project to surface, and now we have project to nearest surface. And the cool thing about this is that we'll project on any direction. So you can have it in between multiple objects and buildings, and it will just project on anything that's closer, which will give you that organic crawling look. So we'll just connect this in between. Okay, and we can leave these for now with the default settings. And then you can see, okay, if I move this here, depending on the distance that we set, so we have a 2-meter max distance. So once you go below that, you see that this will project the points here. And the same thing over here. So if we move this below the 2 meters, we'll get that projected onto the surface. And the same thing here. If we were to move this, it will project on that surface as well. Same thing here. All right. So we can also reduce the tendril probability from 1 to maybe 0.3. Okay. And so this gives us the vine. It doesn't really give us any leaves yet, but it's a good way to actually set up your ivy without having to deal with the leaves and kind of get to what we want, right? So let's say this is the vine that we want. So you'll see that the sweep node now has vines output. So in case you had a vine input, this will be active. And in this case, we can get the leaf generator. And we can connect the vines output to the vines input, hit save, and we'll see the cards. So the default mold for the leaves is cards. You can set up a mesh as well. and you can add your own mesh. There is a mesh that comes with the project, and you have to adjust the scale rotation. There's an offset depending on the type of your mesh and so on and so on. But for now, we'll just use the cards. So what we need for the cards is we actually need a texture. So we'll add a texture. We'll call that leaf texture, and we'll drag it here, connect it. And now go back to our PCG manager, look at our exposed parameter for the texture, and we'll look for a leaf. And there you go, we have our leaf. And as you can see, this leaf has a stem. And again, depending on the texture you use, if you use the one that's in the project, it's already configured for the correct pivot, right? But you might have to adjust that if you use your own leaf. You might have to adjust that so the stems end up at the correct spot. Okay. So this is the basic setup for you to have the Ivy running. And we could, for example, let's see if we get a curve, and let's say, oops, let's say we want to expand this up, and if we move that all the way up, we'll see we get our Ivy crawling up here, and we can change, for example, in the Ivy settings, we can change the branch probability. We can change the there's quite a lot of settings. We can change the branch length, the max branches per stem, or the max branches count. And 0 means that there's no max count, but you could limit the count for your whole Ivy if you want to. And you can change the branch depth, which means that like how many children you get. So I'm just going to reduce the probability a little bit since we increased the children, and you would get like longer running, depth. Basically, you get more children of your children, and that's one way to do a basic setup. We'll go through some of the other additional settings in a second. Now, another thing we can do with this Ivy is we can make this a little bit more realistic by adding some wind effects, which is built in into the shader. So going back to the PCG manager, you can hit create and hit weather, and we'll get this weather created over here, and you see immediately that the branches are swaying. And not only that, but the leaves are also swaying in the wind. And you'll see that you can adjust that through the weather. You can increase the multipliers if you want to for the leaves and for the branches. Another thing you can control through the weather is, we'll go here. So you can add a snow effect. And the snow itself has also a lot of settings. You can also add, let me go to a place where we have a little bit more of the Ivy itself. So you could add a texture to these. So over here, we have for the albedo, if I look in the project, we have a texture for the albedo, and then we have a texture for the normal. So we could do that. You can you can also use that for different purposes. Obviously, you could, if you want to, you could make this and make it look like blood or some sort of acid. Whatever you want to do, you can do that. We could also change the appearance of the leaves quite a lot. So the default we have is the cards, and we have the material hues on top. We could have a palette look, which is essentially not using the card underneath. It's using the card just for the shape, but it's not using it for the color. And you can kind of get a more toony look for this. We could also, um, turn off the blend and have just a few colors. Again, you have quite a lot of flexibility on how this is rendered. You could also increase the hue strength if you want. And essentially what this will do is we'll have less of the card peeking through, less of the actual texture of the leaf, and more of the hue on top. Okay, and also this is pretty well optimized. So essentially now you have just two objects. You have the vine and you have all the leaves, even though they're individually, as you can see, they're swaying individually, but it's all done through a shader. They also have a built-in LODs, and you can control these here. But as you can see, if I move the camera away, you can see first the leaves will disappear, and after I move further away, you'll see that the actual tendrils disappear as well. And as I move in, you get those to appear. You can control the LEDs from the settings. Another thing you can do is you can test the, or you can play around with the automatic adjustment for the vine by having the, as you can see, so basically this cube, let me see, actually not this one, but we'll add, so if we go to the PCG manager and you hit create, and we go to volumes, if you create let's say a cube volume, you'll see that it has this PCG volume monitor. And we've talked about that before in different videos, but essentially all this does is points to the PCG manager, and it will update, or it will trigger an update of the graph every time you make an adjustment to that object. And we'll just enable the mesh renderer for now. So we can move this here, and we'll see that because we have the volume monitor, I can adjust this object and it will refresh the graph. And you can use that on any of your objects. Let's say you have a building or you have cars, streets, anything you have. You can add that, or you can manually adjust the PCG graph. So basically, if I add sphere, for example, and let's say we'll make this like pretty big. So because it doesn't have the monitor object, it's not going to update the graph. But if I hit save on the graph to update it, the graph will take this into account. And if we wanted to automate it, we'll just add the monitor object, and we'll drag our PCG manager here. And then as soon as I move this, it'll automatically update the graph. Another thing here is that, let me readjust this. If we add, let's say, another object here, you'll see that the tendrils automatically adjust based on objects underneath. So these tendrils will stop so they don't intersect with anything that's below. So you should get a pretty decent adjustment to any surface that you want. And again, there's quite a lot of settings. It's all documented. A lot of the settings are also described within the nodes themselves, but it's also included in the documentation where you can read up about all the different settings and how to set it up. If you have any questions, also feel free to reach out on Discord or send an email. Thank you.